Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historic insights. And now that we have covered the history of the American fashion industry, I thought it would be a good time to discuss the history of American shoe companies, because hey, we all have to wear shoes. I mean, unless you want a big piece of glass in your foot, or, other things, our feet need to be covered. Just a basic fact of life. When Europeans first stepped foot in this country, of course, they had footwear. And earlier settlers to this country brought over supplies of strong, sturdy footwear of tanned leather. And each man of John Endicott's company, which settled in Salem, Massachusetts in 1628, was one of the best equipped colonial companies with 4 pairs of boots each. The new land was rough, and even the best shoes wore out very quickly. New supplies were brought from England on the second arriving ship. Naturally, colonists in need of footwear adopted moccasins of the natives made of buckskin leather. These proved to work very well, especially among travelers on foot and hunters. But the total supply of footwear in the new and growing land soon proved insufficient to the needs of people, and they demanded that shoemakers come from the homeland and make shoes for them. The first shoemaker to arrive may have been Thomas Beard, a shoemaker of St. Martin's, London, and his accomplice Isaac Rickman, who was sent over by the New England Company to the settlement of Salem, Massachusetts on May 28, 1629. And so the first American shoemaker prospered in the colonies. He settled in Salem and applied his trade there for possibly more than 14 years. And after that he moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where he purchased an estate and made his home. And other shoemakers soon followed Beard into the colonies. In 1638, a man named Philip Kirtland was granted 10 acres of land in Lynn, Massachusetts to begin shoe manufacturing. Lynn, Massachusetts would later become one of the biggest shoe manufacturing cities in the country. Another colonial shoemaker named Henry Elwell came to this country on the ship the Hercules in 1634. He also settled in Massachusetts. This now gives us a chance to discuss how these shoemakers worked. At first, shoemakers made their shoes in their houses, combining shoemaking with some other occupation. But later, small shops alongside the homes were built. The mortality rate among the early shoemakers was very high because of the air of their workrooms and the cramped position of their lungs while bending over work tables. And after the American Revolution, the shoe trade began to expand. The first shop where leather was tanned and shoes made for the wholesale trade was said to have been in the town of Danvers, Massachusetts, soon after the American Revolution. And while the trade was increasing and the shoemakers were struggling to expand their businesses, old established shoemakers of England and France were sending their shoes to America in such quantities and at such low prices that it was almost impossible for American shoemakers to overcome the competition. To meet this situation, Congress put through a tariff sufficient to keep out European shoes until American shoemakers got a firm to start in their business. You might say Congress gave the foreign shoe companies the boot. Oh, come on, people, I'm giving you gold here. And the development of machinery in the shoe industry was very slow, to say the least. Although the sewing machine was invented in 1846, it was adopted to sewing the upper parts of shoes only in 1851. In the course of time, manufacturers had sewing machines set up in their factories and connected them with steam or other power. Much of this work had previously been done in the home, and the introduction of these power-driven machines made the industry more of a factory industry than ever before. And in 1858, a new kind of sewing machine called the Mackay machine, which sewed the soles of shoes onto the uppers, was invented, and this was followed by the Goodyear welt machine developed between the years 1871 and 1875, which attached the soles of shoes to the uppers by the use of a welt. And anyone wondering what that is, it's a strip of leather, rubber, or plastic that runs along the perimeter of the shoe outsole. And the steam engine was introduced to shoe factories in 1855, and after this, shoemakers themselves were forced into factories as they could not beat the competition of machine-made shoes. The increased production forced the owners into offices to take care of business, and the management of the factories passed into the hands of superintendents and foremen. Specialization began to be carried out on an extensive scale. While formerly one man made a whole shoe, now 50 or 60 people, operating as many machines, and each specializing in a certain operation, make the shoe. And while formerly all kinds and classes of shoe were made in one factory, now certain factories specialized in certain kinds of shoes and thus increased production and cut cost. And some cities, like St. Louis, Missouri, became famous for their shoe factories. By the 1870s, shoe manufacturing had shifted to areas where labor was cheap and more abundant. And at that point in time, St. Louis, Missouri began to emerge as one of the nation's largest centers of shoe production. And as is the case of a lot of garment industry places, women made up a large percentage of the employees. This practice did not change dramatically over the years. Children were also a reliable source of cheap labor in the shoe industry, as were many immigrants. Now, much like ready-made clothing, we have the Civil War to thank for ready-made shoes. It was a laborious process that found some assistance when sewing and leather rolling machines were introduced in the 1840s. And interestingly, pre-Civil War shoe manufacturing in Midwestern cities like St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, and Cincinnati relied heavily on German immigrants, many of whom were skilled craftsmen and artisans. And in St. Louis, immigrant labor provided much of the labor for shoe factories, particularly women and children. And St. Louis shoe manufacturers began to open factories in rural areas during the early 1900s. Women and children continued to make up a bulk of the labor force. A report published in 1907 by the National Child Labor Law Committee indicated that as larger cities like St. Louis began to enforce child labor laws, manufacturers moved factories to smaller towns and cities that had no labor restrictions. The report further cited that St. Louis's, quote, two largest shoe manufacturing operations, which were Brown Shoe Company and Roberts, Johnson and Rand, were among the worst offenders of such practices, quote, employing in most cases several hundred children at their rural factories in Illinois. By 1880, St. Louis had 23 shoe manufacturing firms, and by that time, manufacturing had begun to move west of the riverfront as rail made transport easier in and around the city. Shoe businesses, including wholesale and factories, moved increasingly to the city's center of garment production along Washington Avenue. One such company, Robert Johnson's and Rand, also operated a shoe warehouse and factory on Washington Avenue. The company originated in Memphis, where in 1892, brothers Oscar and Jackson Johnson opened a shoe wholesale business with their cousin Oscar Rand. The business, Johnson and Rand, moved to St. Louis in 1898 when Memphis was hit by yellow fever. The relocation added partners John C. Roberts and his nephew Eugene Roberts, both previously employed by the Hamilton Brown Company. And the companies, started by Brown, Roberts, and Johnson families, would eventually dominate St. Louis's businesses, but at the end of the century, there was a number of major shoe manufacturers, including Peters, Dittman, Johansson, Werthmeyer Schwartz, Friedman Shelby, and Courtney Shoe Companies. Many of these interests operated multiple factories. And after 1900, a number of large factories were built in St. Louis's residential neighborhoods, particularly those supporting German immigrants. Brown Shoe's 1904 Holmes Take Factory on Russell Avenue in the Sollard neighborhood in particular. And now that we have some of the locations out of the way, I figured it would be a good time to talk about the history of two very famous shoe companies, starting with Johnston & Murphy. The company was founded in 1850 by an English immigrant named William J. Dudley, who established his shoe factory in Newark, New Jersey. Dudley teamed with a man named James Johnston in 1880 and continued to manufacture high-quality shoes. When Dudley died in 1882, however, a man named William H. Murphy became Johnston's new partner, and the company became Johnston & Murphy. And they have gone on to become one of the most famous names in footwear, thanks in no small part to the fact that they put shoes on presidents' feet, beginning in 1850 with President Millard Fillmore. They also put shoes on the feet of President Abraham Lincoln, who interestingly had the largest foot of any U.S. president, wearing a size 14 shoe. And during Ulysses S. Grant's term, starting in 1869, he requested that the William Dudley Company craft knee-high riding boots. And the Johnston & Murphy Company still has the original the wooden frames that help determine the size and shape of shoes used to make President Grant's boots. Another well-known shoe manufacturing company would start, believe it or not, because the founders happened to be in a shoe store at the same time. The company to which I am referring is Stacy Adams. It happened when William H. Stacy and Henry Adams were shopping for men's shoes in the same shoe store, and it suddenly dawned on them that all the men's shoes in the store were designed exclusively for function and style was not even considered. They were not at all enthusiastic about this situation, and the salesman working at the store noticed this and introduced the men. And it didn't take long before they realized they both had the same yearning for stylish men's shoes. And so they put their skills together and formed the Stacy Adams Shoe Company. And from that point on, Stacy Adams was born. One of their first popular styles was the Stacy Adams Madison collection with the Stacy Adams original men's black leather Oxford shoe. What set apart Stacy Adams shoes from other shoes was the intricate stitching and making colors that you just couldn't find anywhere for men's shoes. And people have been sporting Stacy Adams shoes ever since 1875. I should know I happen to own a pair. Not one from 1875, of course. I'd be afraid to wear anything that old, really. I have yet to own a pair of Johnston & Murphy's, however. I find them to be a bit pricey. After all, they're one of the few companies that still make everything by hand, and I applaud them for that. And I'm sorry, folks, but it looks as if the clock has got back on us again, and I may have to sign off now. And I think we've learned that companies are always changing. Something may be made entirely by hand during one decade and then made by machine the next. Or made by humans with machine assistance, I should say. And that styles are always changing. However, I still find wingtips to be always fashionable, but that's just me. Anyway, goodbye, God bless, and keep on walking.